Everybody, this is Dan Keldsen with Next Future Today, and just had an awesome chat with David Meerman-Scott. If you don't know him, you might actually know him from his book, The New Rules of Marketing PR, which came out about 15 years ago, and we actually met back then. It's now in its 8th edition. It's sold 500,000 copies, translated into 30 or 40 different languages, I want to say. His newer book, Fanocracy, all about Fandom and how fans operate and how the tribes of fans, why they do what they do and where does that come from. He's a well-traveled international keynote speaker. You might have seen him there. Or if you're a follower of Tony Robbins, he is also a partner of Tony Robbins, coming up on his 10th year anniversary of working with Tony on the Business Mastery program, which is an event-based experience, as you might expect. And so you may have seen him on a stage. You may have read his books. You may have seen him on camera, virtually. And he has quite a lot of insight, I think it is safe to say, in certainly in video, which is definitely important to me and I hope to you. We might as well make the most out of having to be on camera when we are on camera. And specifically, it turns out he has done some research on the neuroscience of eye contact and mirror neurons and proximity to others and how that translates in in-person situations versus virtual. And there's some nuances in there that I definitely was not aware of until we had this chat. So this is wild. I had a plan on what we were going to address in the conversation, 90% of which we did not talk about, which is great because that means now I can talk to him again a couple more times. But the content that we covered, if you are interested at all in making the most out of being on camera as a presenter, as somebody doing podcast interviews or interviewing for a job or anything like that, and also simultaneously using the same kind of things that you learned there in in-person settings or hybrid, which we talk about a fair amount there on how to do it right and why we're screwing that up so badly, then this is definitely an interview that you're going to want to watch, ideally, at the very least listen to it. Anyhow, let's go. David, hey, you probably don't know this, but we actually met probably 10 years ago, and I don't know why you would have any reason to know that, but good to meet you again.
It's good to see you, Dan.
At that point, you had already self-released your first book?
The first book was a novel, and I self-published the novel. My books since then have not been self-published. And The New Rules of Marketing and PR was the one that came out right about the time that I was doing the social media breakfast stuff.
There you go. Yeah. So the book that Tom and I wrote, The Gen Z Effect, we've been thinking about updating because that published in 2014. Certainly been plenty of things that have changed. ChatGPT is one of them, but the pandemic and what that did to all generations, there's plenty of things. So I have all sorts of things. There's plenty of things that we could talk about. Among them, we have a shared love of music. Maybe we get into that. I specifically wore this shirt because if you can tell, those are tiny little skulls.
Nice.
And so one of your favorite bands is the Grateful Dead. Well, I don't know if we want to go down.
I've got my Grateful Dead Wall of Fame is behind me here. So we could certainly go down that path if you want to. I, by the way, just picked up my Plexicam and moved it around. And it's actually super easy to do that. And it's another thing I really like about it. It's not fixed. It allows me to move it around.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that because it is funny that what reconnected us was this crazy company that I accidentally got dragged into, Plexicam.
Accidentally got dragged into. 2020
was a weird year. So my partner, co-author Tom, he had a prototype of Plexicam that he pitched me at the end of March 2020, which was a couple weeks after the lockdown, and who knew how long that was going to last. Originally, I said I wanted nothing to do with it because what do you know about manufacturing and supply chains and logistics and all that fun stuff, and it costs of lawyers for intellectual property protection and all that fun stuff. Eventually, he wore me down where I just woke up and we formally partnered on it. And what I liked was that shortly after we came out, so professional speakers were one of our initial markets because we know lots of professional speakers. Tom's a really great professional speaker. I'm okay. but we know lots and lots of people. And I saw you, on Google Alerts. I got an alert for Plexicam mention, and you had written a nice little blog post on your site. Thank you for the early coverage. It's always fun when I see somebody I know. And I'm like, oh my God. And most people don't even know that I'm part of it, which is even funnier when I reach out and say, hey, thank you. And they're, what?
Yeah, I know, exactly. It's super cool.
Yeah. So you had, you have a prop there. And part of what you mentioned in the article was about mirror neurons and the importance of eye contact and why that is. So what's the neuroscience behind this that I think is so important?
I wrote a book called Fanocracy, and it's all about fandom and fandom culture and how to grow fans of a business. I wrote it with my daughter, Reiko. At the time, she was in her mid-20s in medical school. She's now she's just about finished up with her residency. And one of the things that we wanted to do is look at the neuroscience behind how and why people become fans of something. And we spoke with neuroscientists, and we wanted to really understand deeply what's going on in our brains. And there's a couple of things going on, but one of the most important things is that we humans, it's hardwired in our brains to want to be part of a tribe of like-minded people, because when you're with a tribe of like-minded people, you're safe and comfortable. And that actually goes back tens of thousands of years when we would move in groups, hunt in groups and live in groups and so on. And that kept us safe. Another scientist called Edward T. Hall talked about the actual levels of proximity that we are away from other people in physical space, physically. And he identified several different levels of physical proximity. One he called public space, further than about 12 feet away. And when someone is in our public space further than 12 feet away, our brain knows they're there, but we don't yet start to get concerned about that person. Then you've got between 12 feet and 4 feet, that's called social space. And when someone enters our social space, like at a room or in a restaurant, wherever it might be, our brains process that and say, oh, somebody's getting closer. Is that a friend or a foe? So if you're at a party where you know people, what a great feeling, to have people in your social space. If you're in a crowded subway or a crowded elevator, and people are entering your social space who you don't know, you feel uncomfortable. Again, that's a survival technique. It goes back tens of thousands of years. And then you've got personal space, 4 feet to 1 foot away. Even more powerful connections, either positive or negative, around personal space. So that's one aspect of neuroscience, and I'm getting to the idea of video here in just a second. But understanding that first, what that means is for building fans, how can you bring people together in physical space so they're close to each other? Our buddies over at HubSpot, and I know HubSpot well, they have a conference with between 10 and 20,000 people every year. Pandemic years, of course, were virtual, but 10 or 20,000 people in person at the Boston Convention Center, all of them fans of HubSpot, interacting with one another. What a great way to bring together a tribe of like-minded people to be in the social space and personal space of each other. Fabulous way to build fans. And the neuroscience part around video comes in around a concept called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are the part of our brains which fire when we see somebody doing something as if we are doing it ourselves. The part of our brains that fire when we see someone doing something is the same as when we're actually doing it ourselves. So I have a lemon and a slice of lemon. If I take a bite of the lemon, it's super powerful. I will feel it on my tongue and so on. Let me do that now. So take a bite, and it's on my lips and it's on my tongue, and my eyes are kind of watering a little bit. I mean, biting a lemon is super powerful. My brain is firing, but yours is too, right, Dan? Can you feel the lemon? Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? And if you're you're watching this video on YouTube or somewhere else, you're probably feeling the lemon. I bet even if you're only listening, you're not seeing me hold up the lemon, you're probably also tasting a little bit of lemon on your tongue. So that's the neuroscience behind mirror neurons. Now it gets really interesting when you're talking about video, because right now if you're only listening, Dan and I are both on video. We've both got our Plexicam, so we're looking directly at the camera. We've both got the camera set up so it's at eye level. We're not looking up or down or sideways or something at the camera. And we're both cropped and in a sort of head and shoulders style shot. It feels to us as if we're in each other's personal space, about 4 feet away. If you were sitting across from me at a small cocktail table in a bar, we'd be 4 feet away, and we'd be in personal space, and we'd be having a great conversation. And as it is, we're in virtual space, but our brain, just like that lemon, our brain processes this conversation as if we are literally in the same room. And that's precisely why you feel that you know a movie star, or you feel as if you personally know a television star. The idea of looking directly at the camera at eye level, cropped as if you're in somebody's personal space, focused directly on that camera, which Plexicam allows you to do, is based in neuroscience, the best way to engage with people.
Awesome. That's so creepy that I can still taste lemon, by the way.
Yeah, right? And it's so creepy. It's so creepy that later on today, it's like, oh yeah, what a great conversation with Dan. It was so good to be in the same room. No, it wasn't in the same room. It was all virtual.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny that I hadn't thought about that. So I've heard from other people about the importance of cropping, but not specifically because of that. And it does make.
Well, we like I said, we dug in deep. We interviewed neuroscientists around what's going on in our brain when we do this, because we really wanted to learn, how do you build fans? No one had written a book quite like ours before. Fanocracy is the title of the book. How do people build fans?
That's wild. So I had a plan on what we would talk about. This was a sprinkle of this was in there. Let's run with it a little bit. So and when did Fanocracy come out? Was it pre-pandemic?
Fanocracy, the publication date was January 2020. And I had a whole bunch of speaking gigs lined up. I was going to, several different countries, and bang, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we all had to figure out this virtual thing, and so I had already done the research. Fanocracy hit. I'm like, bang, I understand this. I got to run with it. And I did a quickie book called Standout Virtual Events. I say quickie. I wrote it really quickly when the pandemic hit, and I published it on Kindle Direct Publishing. It came out in September 2020, so it was pretty early, about how to use how to a great virtual event. And so fortunately, all of this research on neuroscience, and especially as it relates to how do you use and do virtual events, was ended up being very helpful. Did I ever know when the whole world was in lockdown in early 2020?
That's amazing. My question was, you had a plan for your business, yourself, your career, whatever, on January 1 of 2020. Now what? Was that plan? Were you like leading in your field or your industry or whatever, and you were already prepared for it? You weren't COVID, hopefully. If you were, then you're to blame. But, did you have had you already gotten to a point where your business was resilient, or had already made some plans that accidentally worked out and set you up for a different path than somebody who was not paying attention and had not really made investments in automation, for example, or already had a clue on how to use Zoom and things like that in a basis?
Right. I run a one-person business. I write books, I deliver speeches, and I advise companies. And so for me, and the biggest revenue ongoing is my speaking engagements. So for me, 2020, I think I had 20 speeches booked for the year. I mean, and I would get many more. In a normal year, I would get more as the year went on. But I had 20 booked already in January. I did a couple in January and a couple in February, and then bang, everything shut down, and I had to, what am I going to do now? So yeah, my business was affected deeply by the pandemic. If I'm doing 30 or 40 speeches a year all over the world, and all of a sudden 0. So, but said earlier, I had neuroscience to understand how virtual works. I had jumped in deep in the technology. I put in a 4-camera studio down the hall in the next room to be able to do really high quality professional level virtual events from my home. It's not the same, but I was able to at least do some, in some cases, do some speaking engagements virtually. I can be lucky that I had the be able to figure out how to pivot my business quickly and still be able to serve people, still be able to have fun doing it.
Yeah.
And we're just coming back now. I mean, in-person speaking gigs are now, I believe, back to where they either almost or nearly to where they were before. And
sure.
People are hungry for that in-person connection. So,
right.
If you're out there thinking about doing an in-person event, now is the time. Because you get back and meet one another.
Yeah. Well, and so a timeline, but at some point you joined forces with Tony Robbins, and you've been doing, has it been always in person or virtual, or how has that worked out?
I'm coming up on my 10th in January of 2024, so very soon. As we're recording this, is very, very soon.
Okay.
And initially, it was, of course, all in person. I did each year between 2 and 4 events with Tony around the world, 2 of them to the United States, and then sometimes several outside the U.S. And so Tony in 2020 went the virtual route in a massive way. His virtual studio located in Palm Beach, Florida is unbelievable. He spent millions and millions of dollars to acquire a building and build a purpose studio that's designed for the kind of unbelievably upbeat, exciting, interactive kind of performance-based training that Tony is so great at. And I speak at the Tony's Business Mastery events. He's got other events that I don't speak at, but the Business Mastery event is now, most of them are now these days hybrid, where he's got an in-person, think of it like a studio audience, and he's got thousands of people watching it virtually. It's a great program, Tony Robbins Business Mastery. And it's a highlight of my year, time I get a chance to speak on a Tony Robbins stage, because it's such a well-done, highly produced event.
Yeah. It's funny. So type of virtual event business also in 2020, and because our background in technology tied to fanocracy. So if you're a tech company, HubSpot or any other Salesforce, there are plenty of companies. A good idea is to have a user conference where you highlight your best customers. They get to prospective customers or up and coming customers get to meet them, and it's a whole experience, right? So, but in 2020, if you had a user conference lined up, did you really want to just turn that into a Zoom call? Yeah, our bet was no.
And that all failed when you took an in-person event and crammed it into a Zoom room. It just didn't work. You had to create something new and something different. That's why Tony Robbins succeeded. Is he recognized that it's like the difference between live theater on Broadway versus a movie. They're utterly different things, even though they might tell the same story in the same number of hours. It's the same thing with an event. A 2-day event in person is an utterly different animal than a 2-day event virtual.
Right. Yeah, it can be in person. It's like when you have large audiences in person, it's hard to get engagement. As opposed to, I'm not a huge fan of like chat windows that are scrolling by. Tell me what city you're in. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Not super engaging necessarily, but at least you get a feeling that people are paying attention.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other things, some of them cuter than others, on getting people engaged. But just our bet was, and this is what got me going. So Viventus was the name of that company. Right. Since shut it down. But we were beta testing plexicams because cameras were hard to get in the early parts of 2020.
I remember that. I remember I wanted to get a new Logitech cam, just a simple webcam, like $100, $150. You couldn't get them.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you could, they were twice as much.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of Chinese knockoffs, as it turns out, that look exactly like the Matinee.
Right.
But we would, because most people they didn't have a home office set up that was ready for video. If they had any computer, it was probably a laptop for their work. So they didn't have an external camera, and Flexicam didn't exist, except that we were beta testing it. So we would send out, we can't help you better than the signal that we get from you, right? So we would send a better than average camera out. At one point, we were sending Brios out, which I think you're using right now, along with a Plexicam, and it was, most people are also terrified. If you're used to standing on a stage, that's a different energy and potential fear, and all sorts of things that are going on there. When it's in your own house and you've never had to present, you have to put energy into the little pinhole on your camera, or the big pinhole on my expensive camera here, to get it out the other end. Otherwise, it's just like you're talking to dead people, which is probably not what you go for.
Right.
In virtual land, you don't necessarily want to have inbound. HubSpot's event is 2 or 3 days, I think. 4 days,
I think it's for the main event, and they have some side stuff, but yeah.
So if you were doing that all virtually as a attendee, it's exhausting to do that, and you're just I have ADHD, so it's also lots of other things going on that could catch attention.
Another shiny object to look at.
Yeah. So what I was for people was, instead of if you're doing a big user conference at a huge hotel, it's hideously expensive. You're spending millions of dollars to put that event on.
Right.
So instead of doing it once a year, and it takes 4 months to build up to it and get everything lined up so you're there, why not do twice a year or once a quarter? And then you can do faster iterations and take advantage of this, so you don't have to kill people with 3 or 4 days of an event. You can have a 3-hour event that's every 3 months.
Right. And then what my clients did, which I thought was fascinating, was they had, like you said, multiple events, but they optimized it for certain time zones. So I remember one client, her company name is Skillsoft. They did of events, one optimized for North American time zones, one optimized for Europe time zones, and one optimized for Australia and Asia time zones. So that, and I presented it all, and it was done over, I think it was like a 3-day period. I can't remember exactly. Each event was 4 or 5 hours, but the Asian event was during their business day. So I can't remember the time, but I think, we were in the studio at 4 o'clock in the morning doing that event, and that worked great. A lot of people who live in other parts of the world, other time zones, especially halfway around the world, they don't want 2 o'clock in the morning watching somebody who's speaking at 2 in the afternoon New York time. Let's get it when I'm eating lunch, not when you're eating lunch. And that worked out great. And it was a completely way of doing an event, because you would never do that in person. Oh, let's do our in the morning. No, bad idea. You would never do that. You would never do that in an in-person event, but it can be totally done in a virtual event. Yeah, let's just get the executives into the studio or wherever we're going to do it at 2 in the morning. It's great. Let's do it.
Right. Yeah.
And they ended up rooms for people so that, you could be read and whatnot. It worked out great. I thought it was super, super clever how that was pulled together.
Yeah, and I think that's, I'm guilty of this too. I would prefer being in person. If it's amongst my tribe, it's a great feeling. But I think that there's so many people that have been just like, oh, thank God we can go back to in person, but they never really figure out virtual or hybrid, certainly.
Yeah.
But it can open up opportunity. For the first time, potentially, your customers in Australia are actually getting your attention during a time when they're alive.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you're particularly looking forward to? Maybe anything new or something terribly important that nobody's talking about for 2024?
We've already done it, but I'm thrilled that we're getting back to in-person speaking. Something that, completely during the main part of the pandemic, and then kind of a little bit started to come back, and feels like it's really coming back now. And I'm also interested in done well. Hybrid is mostly hybrid is taking an in-person event, in a hotel ballroom or in a convention center, and then having then streaming the keynotes, and maybe streaming some of the breakout rooms. That's it. That's what most is. And it's a horrible experience for the people who are doing the virtual part of it. But there's a number of organizations, I think, who are starting to really understand how to do hybrid well. And again, we mentioned him before, but Tony Robbins and his team have done an amazing job with hybrid, where it feels a television studio is where the event is being produced, and those people in the room are almost like a studio audience. And then you've got and with interactive, and the speakers engage with the audience like good speakers do. But then virtual is not an afterthought. And what part of Tony's is they have trainers, they have people who help participants to learn the material. There's times to reflect, times to interact with other people about what you're thinking and discuss ideas. And the in-person and the virtual both have those components, so that if you're in the room, you get in a group of 6 people and you talk about a problem for 20 minutes. If you're virtual, you get in a virtual breakout room with 6 people and you talk for 20 minutes. It's exactly the same. It's curated in a similar way to optimize what happens in an in-person environment and optimize what's possible using the technology for a virtual environment. And I'm excited by that. I think that's a super interesting development that never, ever would have happened without the pandemic, because we wouldn't have learned as much as we have learned about virtual. So that's, to me, is hybrid done right. Sadly, hybrid is done wrong, but there are pockets of people, Tony Robbins being a great example, who are doing hybrid right.
Right. Yeah, I think and people can slice in some footage of the behind the scenes or the experience of the Tony Robbins hybrid or totally virtual events. When we were doing Ventus, I ran into some people who have been behind the scenes, setting up the infrastructure for Tony. The cloud stuff that they had to do to make any of that work was insane.
They had to do communications, and exactly. The first time I was studio, I couldn't believe it. It was a virtual studio, and Tony was on stage, and I was going to go on stage soon after. So there's one person on stage at that point, and when I spoke, there was one person on stage, but there's 40 or 50 people behind the scenes just making sure everything's perfect, and camera operators and audio people and people who are making sure that every single individual, all however many, 3,000-4,000 of them who are participating in the event, all of them have a great experience. And I mean, it was just unbelievable. And it's only improved as they've learned, but they had to make it all up as they went along. They had to figure out how to create that technology. And that's exciting, And I don't want back to the pandemic world, but we did learn a lot. We learned a ton about virtual and so on.
I think that so I spent a lot of my world focused on innovation and doing consulting work for innovation. What does that even mean? Who's allowed to do it? Who actually doesn't? Right. But we condensed 10 to 20 years worth of a normal technology life cycle into 6 months or a year or a couple of years anyhow. And in a lot of ways, I think that was awesome, which I feel terrible saying. All right, well, awesome. So thank you so much. I'm glad we were able to align our calendars finally and have a chance to talk.
Yeah, me
thank
too.
you for indulging me in my insanity and our joint insanity maybe in our conversation.
I think we're both a little bit insane with that. And thank you for doing Plexicam. I use mine almost every single day, and I'm sharing it with others. Awesome. I have shared it with other people, and I know other people who bought it as a result of my recommendations and so on. So great product. Awesome. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you. It's been crazy, but I'm glad that people enjoy it and get what we intend out of it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Dan. Take care.